Bonsoir. Bonsoir à tous. Chers amis, nous sommes ravis d'accueillir ce soir dans le programme du cycle de conférences de la Monaco Méditerranée Foundation le plus célèbre chercheur de la longévité et du vieillissement. Il s'agit de Walter Longo, le professeur Walter Longo, biologiste et spécialisé en biologie cellulaire. Il est italo-américain et il est né en Italie en 1967. Fasciné par les secrets de la longévité, il quitte l'Italie très jeune et va continuer ses études aux États-Unis. Aujourd'hui, il est professeur à l'Université de Californie du Sud, monsieur, à Los Angeles, et il dirige un des laboratoires les plus réputés au monde sur le vieillissement et la longévité. Ses recherches montrent que notre alimentation influence profondément notre santé et notre espérance de vie. Imaginez qu'il soit possible de ralentir le vieillissement simplement en modifiant notre alimentation. Cela ressemble à de la science-fiction, mais c'est précisément la question que s'est posée le professeur Longo pendant des années, et aujourd'hui, il a une réponse. Les recherches de Walter Longo ont été publiées dans de nombreuses revues scientifiques internationales. Son livre, Le régime de longévité, est devenu une référence pour toutes les personnes qui sont intéressées à la santé et au vieillissement. Vous aurez gracieusement, il vous sera offert un livre à la sortie de la conférence. Nous vous prions d'en prendre seulement un par couple ou un par personne pour qu'il y en ait pour tout le monde. Je passe maintenant la parole au professeur Longo qui va nous dire ce que nous devons mettre dans notre assiette pour vivre plus longtemps. Walter.
Okay, thank you to the foundation for inviting me. Glad to be here, and I'm sorry that I studied French for 6 or 7 years in school in Italy, but it didn't help me much. So I'm going to present in English, and so I'll just take this. So I been studying since I was 19 years old. I've been studying longevity and aging. I was always very fascinated by the science, but I also was fascinated by the medical. I always thought, what an incredible opportunity to do the really interesting science. How do organisms become old, and more importantly, how to keep them young, but at the same time have this potential impact on medicine. Right at the time when I started in the late 80s, people were not thinking about longevity medicine. It was just didn't exist. But I thought it's got to be the most important thing. I don't see people sick when they're young, so it has to be that aging is the most important factor for diseases. And this is what's shown here, right? So this is I got from Matt Chamberlain, and when he showed it, I was very impressed. So it's showing obesity and smoking as the major risk factors for cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. And then I was very impressed when he showed the next slide, which was put them against 30 years of aging. And if you look at Alzheimer's, for example, smoking and obesity disappear, right? They're so unimportant, as important as they are, right? They're so unimportant compared to 30 years of aging, right? So I thought, this is great, and this is what we always thought, right? You have to treat aging first, right? Everything else is going to come. Of course, you keep treating, you should quit smoking and keep a good weight and all of that, but that's not the point. Obviously, I'm not saying that that's okay. I'm just saying aging is so much more important than even all those put together, that we should focus on that. And this is not just these 3 diseases, but these are 3 of the major ones. Okay, so then, of course, aging, but nobody wants to age poorly, and so we've been talking a lot about health span, right? So this is an English term, but I don't know what the French version of that term is, but certainly everybody talks about health span. But I also always thought, and I introduced this term, juventology and youth span, right? So the idea is, now let's say that people stay young until, you could say 40, right? Young until 40, is it possible? And so until 40, most people don't get any disease, right? It's just almost a perfect system to keep you away from all diseases. And then all of a sudden, and that's pretty much also goes along with professional ability of professional sports athletes to perform, right? Then after that, you age and you become dysfunctional. So is it possible to move that 40 to 50, maybe even 60, right? Will we see professional soccer players, for example, in 20 years being on the field at 57, right? So that's definitely doable if we can work on youth span, right? It's not that many years, right? From now, let's say Tom Brady, one of the most famous football player, American football player in history, played until 45, professional football as a quarterback in the United States, right? So it's not that far, right? I'm imagining that you're gonna have athletes that are 57, still in the field, performing at the very top of the world levels. Okay, so how do you get there? And I didn't put it because it's a French presentation. I always show this, right? So, and this is Madame Calmont from France, and she still holds the record of longevity. She lived until 122 and a half, and she smoked until she was 117. And so, of course, you hear a lot of people saying, well, she smoked until 117, maybe we can all smoke. Well, that's not the case, right? And most likely, Madame Calmont had the right genes, right? So for the longest time, until the mid-90s, early 2000, we had no genes that cause longevity extension, right? We didn't know of a single gene that could make any organism live longer. And then my laboratory, Cynthia Kenyon, Tom Johnson, different laboratories that started identifying genes. My laboratory identified something called TOR, a cis kinase. Cynthia Kenyon, something called IGF-1, insulin signaling genes. And so we started seeing this simple organisms could be programmed. So for example, if you look at the 2 dots on the left, you see that the small dot is a simple organism that is being reprogrammed and now can live 10 times longer by a combination of 2 genetic mutations plus a fasting, right? So we fast them and we genetically manipulate 2 genes, and the 2 genes are one in the glucose pathway, we call the sugar pathway, and one in the protein pathways, right? So if we do 2 genetic mutations plus we starve them, now they live 10 times longer. And, the remarkable, in the 100 years of research, the most remarkable model has been the little mice there, right? The mice on the right, the small mice, they live 40% longer. If you fast them, or if you calorie restrict them, they live twice as long, right? Twice as long. It's really remarkable achievement, let's say. But the more impressive thing is not only they live up to twice as long, but half of these mice will never develop any disease, right? And that's really very surprising, and it will completely change medicine if we could achieve in people what's been achieved in these little mice, right? So that's what we've been focusing on the genetic side of things. And so we started studying people that have the same mutation as those little mice, right? These people, 100 of them live in Ecuador, in the mountains of southern Ecuador, and they have this growth hormone receptor deficiency mutations, right? The mutation that causes growth hormone receptor deficiency. Now, when we started studying them, we, first of all, realized maybe like Madame Calment, that they had a terrible lifestyle, and you know, they were eating, drinking, not exercising. So at the beginning, I thought it's going to be very difficult to show benefits in this population because they're not doing anything healthy. And so we started studying them, but it turned out that instead they were very much protected. So if you look at the left, here's cancer deaths. Their relatives, a lot of them died of cancer, and they didn't. And then if you look on the right, even though they're more obese, so GHRD are these little people with the mutation in the growth hormone, right? So you see GHRD, they're more likely to be obese, and yet very few of them develop diabetes, right? So they're protected from cancer, they're protected from diabetes. Then we brought them to Los Angeles to actually look at their brain function, right? With the cognitive decline. So the mice, the little mice, they live so much longer, they were also protected from memory loss, age-dependent memory loss. And so we started, we did functional MRIs, and this is just, you know, don't worry about the details, but just if you look at where it says GHRDs, these little people, right? If you look at the center where it says lure, right? And then you look at the bottom, this is their ability of people to distinguish between objects they've already seen and objects that were similar to the ones they've already seen, right? The brain of a young person is very good at doing that. I've seen that object, or no, I've seen something similar to that object, but it was not that object, right? Old people cannot do that. Young people can. And so now you see the pattern below the GHRD is very similar to the 20-year-olds. And the pattern between the controls, both of which are about 50 years old, is more similar to the 70-year-olds, right? If you look at the center where it says lure, right? So cognitively, these little people are more similar to very young people compared to their you know, same age relatives that are more similar to older people, probably because of having a poor lifestyle. Okay, so this is just, don't worry about the details, but this is showing you the network, right? There's network in every human body controlled by lots of things, but the two major controllers, as I mentioned earlier, are proteins and sugars, right? So proteins are now controlling these growth factors on one side, and on the other side, sugars are controlling insulin resistance, and the other side. So now if you have lots of sugar and lots of amino acids and proteins, you're gonna age more quickly, right? And now very consistently we see cancer, obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, and all of that. Okay, so if you look at probably the most impressive study of all times done at the University of Wisconsin, actually from somebody that was in my own lab, in the same lab I was in before me at UCLA, and this was done on monkeys, right? So this group at the University of Wisconsin took a lot of monkeys, and they either kept them on a normal diet or the same identical diet, but 25% less calories, right? So it's called calorie restriction. And the results, I think, are impressive. Those that were on the calorie-restricted diet, the ones that were on a normal diet, 60% of them developed either diabetes or pre-diabetes. And that went down to 5% just by calorie restriction. Tumors were reduced by 50%, cardiovascular disease reduced by 20 to 30%, right? So now you're seeing similar in monkeys, which are primates very close to us. You're starting to see similar effect from those that I show you in the little mice, right, with genetic mutation. That means that it is possible in humans to at least get rid of, let's say, most of the great majority of the pre-diabetes, diabetes, and maybe 50% of cancers, and maybe 20, 30% or more of cardiovascular disease, right? So how do you do it? Well, calorie restriction is not the way to do it. And why is that? Well, if you look at the left, this is mortality caused by diseases like diabetes-dependent mortality, cancer-dependent mortality. And so you see the calorie-restricted group does much better than the non-calorie. So the black is calorie-restricted, the red the red is control, and you see that the survival is much better. But if you look at all-cause mortality, you see them almost identical, right? So that means that there are trade-offs. So if you are calorie restricted like this, you're going to get benefits and you're going to get problems, right? So the question is, how do you get these incredible benefits? This will, literally revolutionize medicine if you could do this, right? So this will be more success than anything is any research agency has ever done in history, right? Getting rid of 90% of diabetes and prediabetes, 50% of cancer, 30% of cardiovascular disease. So how do we get this without the problems? And actually, Walford, you see the bald guy, he was a medical doctor, he was my boss back in the early 90s at UCLA, and he did the first human experiment on calorie restriction, right? So he locked himself up in this place in the desert of Arizona, near Tucson, and did the first human study like the monkeys that I've just shown you, right? So the first human calorie restriction study. And so the results are really very similar to the ones that you saw for monkeys. Now you look, I don't have anything to point, but if you look at systolic blood pressure, if you look at the vertical line on the left, is when they enter. So they enter with a healthy blood pressure, about 110. But then they drop down to 90. And glucose, they enter, let's say, a healthy 90, and then they drop down to 70. Cholesterol, they start with 185, they drop down to 125. So you look at this and you say, wow, this is amazing. Any cardiologist will say, this is great. Or you can look at this, maybe it's not so great, right? Why? Maybe you've been pushed too low. You've been pushed to the limit. Maybe you've been pushed over the limit, right? And this is Walford on the left when he came out of Biosphere 2. He was pushed to the limit, right? So cholesterol was very low, blood pressure was very low, glycemia was very low, but he was not good. He wasn't healthy. So then, since then, the effort by my group has been, how do we get these incredible benefits without the problems that come with calorie restriction, and without the impossibility? People will never do this, right? So maybe 1 in 1,000 will be able to do long-term calorie restriction. So what can people do? And so I was aware of species like the emperor penguins of the South Pole, and the emperor penguins, they can go 2-3 months with no food while they're incubating the eggs. And so I started thinking, well, people cannot fast for 2 or 3 months, but what if they fasted for a few days, right? Say 5 days, 7 days, and then what if then they return to the normal diet? Could this be long-lasting? Could have long-lasting effects, right? So we developed something called fasting mimicking diet. So can you intervene for 5 days with a diet that is low in calorie, low in sugar, low protein, high in fat, plant-based, right? It's a very healthy diet. They learn from all the longevity zones of the world, but it's a fasting mimicking diet, right? So it's equivalent, it has the same molecular effects as if you were not eating at all for 5 days. Okay. So, one study we always wanted to do, we finished a few years ago, and there was, what if I give mice the worst possible American diet, right? And high fat, high sugar, high calorie, and then I intervene for just 5 days a month with a fasting mimicking diet. And we thought, okay, so if we give them a terrible diet, it's gonna be bad for them. And then we give them the FMD, it's gonna make it a little bit better, right? That's what we thought. Maybe halfway between a good diet and a bad diet, right? So the control is a good diet, very healthy diet, and the HFCD is a bad diet, and then FMD plus HFCD, maybe in between. But instead, what we saw was completely reversed, right? So, and this started to tell us maybe there's no cumulative effect of bad food. Maybe it's just about resetting periodically, right? So the bad food is not bad for you because it does damage every day. Maybe the bad food is bad because it puts you in a different modality, maybe a quicker aging modality, right? And you gotta get out of it once in a while, reset, so that you don't age, because it's something else that makes you age, right? So at the end you see the mice with the bad diet and the controls, and then in the middle the bad diet plus 5 days amount of the fasting mimicking diet. And also the mice, the fasting mimicking diet causes weight loss, fat loss, but not lean body mass loss, right? So now the GLP-1 receptor agonist, a lot of these drugs that now a lot of people are taking for weight loss, they will cause fat loss, but also muscle loss and potentially bone density decrease, right? So now you're seeing in mice that you get exactly what you want. The fat is down, but the muscle mass is not, right? So also, we look at cholesterol, you see that the HFCD, the bad diet, the cholesterol increases with aging, but you don't see that in you see the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet, reversing these effects, right? So it's going after multiple systems, not just fat loss. And this the remarkable thing is the longevity. This is the lifespan curve, right? First of all, if you look at the purple on the left, that's the Western diet, right? And it's remarkable that the bad diet could almost cut the lifespan in half, right? So they live a lot shorter, a lot sicker, with a lot of cholesterol, a lot of problems, and actually a lot of problems that humans have, including, I'm not going to show it, heart problems, and the enlargement of the left ventricle, and the lowering of what's called the ejection fraction, right? So, yeah, so then the Western diet in mice is recapitulating the problem caused by bad diets in humans, but the FMD, the green line toward the right, is now restoring most of the lifespan back to the ideal diet. Not quite, but pretty close. Okay, so then what about the human fasting mimicking diet, right? So what happens if you take, in this case, 100 people in Los Angeles, and we give them 3 cycles of the FMD once a month for 3 months, and then we measure lots of different things. And unlike, well, first of all, you see the same as we saw in mice, right? So they're losing a lot of fat, body weight, waist circumference, but they're not losing lean mass, right? In fact, the relative lean mass is actually increased, right? So this system knows that it shouldn't touch. For example, grizzly bears, when they hibernate, they don't lose lean mass, they lose fat, right? Because it's an evolved process. The drugs don't have the sophistication, but this does, right? So it's able to break down the fat, but not the muscle, and for obvious reasons. Okay, then remember, with calorie restriction, everything went down, right? Doesn't matter whether it was glucose or cholesterol, even if it was low, it went further down. And in this case, we don't see that. We see that if somebody has normal glucose, it stays normal. But if somebody is pre-diabetic, then it comes down a lot. If somebody, this is systemic inflammation, C-reactive protein, somebody has normal level, nothing changes. But if they have high CRP, then they come down. Same thing for blood cholesterol. If they started with less than 200, they're okay, they should stay there. If they started with more than 200, now they come down. And same thing, systolic blood pressure. Now keep in mind, this is not a group that was hypertense, but again, those that were more than 120, they had some mild hypertension, they came down back, most of them back to normal. So the system, these cycles are resetting the system. So most people, when you're 20, you don't have high blood pressure, you don't have high cholesterol, you don't have insulin resistance and high glycemia. So this is bringing the functionality back to that of a much younger person. And okay, so then what about if we go head to head with the Mediterranean diet? What if we switch people for 4 months on the Mediterranean diet, or we just do 4 cycles of the 5-day FMD? So in one case, you have a cumulative, 120 days, and the other case, you have 20 days of intervention with the diet. So what happens, and a lot of the beneficial, they were both beneficial, so weight loss and all of that, and insulin resistance reversal. But if you look at muscle mass, the Mediterranean diet after 4 months is causing 3 pounds, about 1.5 kilogram of muscle loss, and the FMD does not. And then after 7 months, now you reach about 2.5 kilograms of lean mass loss, which is not observed in the FMD, right? So again, another trial, the first one was 100 patients, this one 84 patients, is confirming that this is performing better than even the Mediterranean diet, even though it does not require switching to any particular diet. And also, we started seeing in A1C, so one of the major factors to diagnose diabetes, decrease, not much of a decrease in those that are normal. Pre-diabetic, they have A1C reduction. The diabetic now has the biggest A1C reduction, and now it's getting in the range of drug pharmacological intervention just by doing 4 FMD cycles, 4 monthly FMD cycles. And this is just to show you that this is done by University of Heidelberg in diabetes patients, and now not only the diabetes patients are at the very top, you see where it says HOMA, this is insulin resistance. So after 6 cycles of the FMD, there's a major decrease in insulin resistance, but it's also, without going into the detail, 70% of the patients are now able to reduce the medication, right? They either reduce diabetes medication or eliminate the diabetes medication. And that's what we want. And a lot of the drugs are there to keep a person, manage the disease. Now, the pharmaceutical companies say manage the disease, but it's okay. Some people need to manage the disease, but a lot of people can actually go back to full health and have no drugs, and that's probably how you make it to a very long lifespan. And if you look at, on the left is the reduction of diabetes drugs, but on the right is the reduction of hypertension medication. So if you're going after the aging process, you should not just see one disease being lowered or reversed. You should see multiple conditions and risk factors and diseases being reversed. And that's what you see here now with the FMD cycles. Okay, so then what about technology now, especially in the United States? There is a lot of talk about reprogramming, right? So it is and something called Yamanaka factor. Some of you have probably heard about this, right? So Yamanaka, who discovered these factors and their ability to make all cell young, right? And he got the Nobel Prize for that a number of years ago. And but the aging field sort of picked it up and said, well, is it possible if a cell can become younger, then now we can make an organism younger? That's much, much harder. But these Yamanaka factors are now being studied for their ability to make organs younger and systems younger and potentially people younger. Again, it's a little bit of science fiction, but there's a lot of big companies with big investors going after this, right? So we've always been very interested in multi-system regeneration and rejuvenation. And so in this case, we look at a diabetes model, and I'll just jump over there. This is type 2 diabetes model, and the cycles of the fasting-making diet are very effective to treat type 2 diabetes in mice. But that's not what I want to show you. What I want to show you is type 1 diabetes. The type 1 diabetes is when the pancreas is no longer able to make insulin, right? So we give the mice this drug called streptozotocin, and you see the red color on the left. That's a mouse that has a functional beta cell insulin-producing pancreas, right? So the pancreas is making normal levels of insulin, and that's red, right? Then you see where it says STZBLD5. That's after we've given this toxin that destroys the insulin-producing beta cells. So now in the middle, they became type 1 diabetes mice, right? They cannot make insulin anymore. Then after that damage is permanent and is done, we start with the fasting mimicking diet, right? Cycles. We do a number of cycles, in this case, 5 cycles. And then you see what's happening on the right. By day 30, the pancreas starts making insulin again, right? It restored insulin generation, and it's a permanent. So not only it's reversing the problem, it's now permanent. So it's permanently reprogramming the beta cells that are damaged to making insulin. And the reason for that, if you see that, it's 3 lanes. One says AL, FMD, RF1D, right? So AL are mice that are given normal food, right? Then in the middle, there are mice at the end of the fasting mimicking diet. And then on the right is the mice on day 1 of refeeding. And what all these markers are kind of like Yamanaka factors. They're all embryonic developmental genes, right? So it means that during the fasting mimicking diet, the pancreas is now being reprogrammed to begin the job of rebuilding anything that is lost. Right? And it knows exactly what to go after. So it's not going after alpha cells because they're fine. It's going after beta cells because they've been damaged. So it fixes it, and then you see all the reds, and for example, where it says OCT4, OCT4, that's one of the Yamanaka factors, right? So it's turning up Yamanaka factor for just one day, and then it turns it off. And then it turns out a long list of developmental genes, right? So it is the ability to search, identify the problem, and then turn on embryonic developmental factor to rebuild what's been destroyed. Okay, so this is the mouse pancreas. Then we said, okay, to prove that this is going to go all the way to humans, let's change organism. Let's do it in a rat, and let's change organ. Let's do it in a kidney of a rat, right? So now this is a slice of a rat kidney, right? So you see on top, it's just the entire kidney is sliced, right? And that's histochemistry. And then we use this puromycin that damages the kidney permanently. So the kidney are now like a chronic kidney disease patient. They're no longer working. And you see that pattern at the top is completely disrupted, right? And then we do 6 cycles of the fasting mimicking diet in the rat. And you see at the bottom is what we call spatial transcriptomics, right? It's showing you the cellular pattern of a rat kidney, and all the different colors are different cell types, right? You see how they're in a very precise conformation, right? And so now we give the toxin, the nephrotoxin in the middle, and you see all of it is disrupted. So now they're everywhere. Then we start and we give 6 cycles of the fasting mimicking diet, and you get the pattern back, right? It knows exactly how to bring it back to full health, right? So this is suggesting now we're seeing it in the blood, we see it in the pancreas, we see it in the kidney. So we're starting to see in all organs. So is it possible that this fasting mimicking diet, especially in refeeding, is turning on the ability of the human body to fix almost anything that is being damaged, right? And it would make sense that you have that, because if you think about it, if you cut yourself, after a couple of weeks, that cut is completely repaired, right? So why would we have a repair for the skin and have no repair system for anything else, right? Maybe the most sophisticated medicine of all is not a drug, it's not surgery, although these are very important. Nobody's arguing against drugs or surgery. But maybe the most powerful medicine of all is these programs that the human body has always had. The mouse body, the rat body, all the mammals have it. And they're incredibly powerful. And imagine to try to do that with drugs, right? Imagine to go from them permanent mass to that, back to normal with drugs, right? Or AI, even if you brought in AI and all the sophistication in the world, it would take you decades to reproduce that effect, right? So this is billions, this is 3.5 billion years old. So it started with bacteria that started something called autophagy, right? The bacteria already billions of years ago started breaking down their own components and eating them for the sake of feeding on them. And then once food came back around, during starvation period, right? They ate themselves. And then when food came back around, they reused the new nutrients to rejuvenate and re-expand, right? So this is the evolution of that simple process. And of course, I didn't show it, but it also involves autophagy, right? The cell-feeding process. So first autophagy, cell-feeding, then stem cells, reprogramming. This very sophisticated system involving probably thousands of genes, each in a very coordinated way, having the job of rebuilding a damaged kidney in this case. Okay, and this is the result for people at the University of Rome, a randomized crossover trial, a small trial. But now you look at where it says K, and this is proteinuria in patients with chronic kidney disease on the left. And then it says after the FMD cycles, and then 1 year follow-up. So not only is it improving the proteinuria, a year later it's still improved, right? So it's just a long, like we've seen for the rat kidney, is a long-term effect in repairing the kidney. Of course, this is got to be repeated with 300 or 400 patients, but it's a good start, right? It's a very good start. And now look at the bottom where it says N, look at the circulating progenitor and stem cell, the kidney progenitor and stem cell. So now these patients in circulation have a threefold increase in stem cells, right? And they happen to be kidney stem cells. So what's going on? They're detecting the problem in the kidney because of fasting refeeding, and either they're coming from the kidney because they've already done the repair, or they're going to the kidney to do the repair. So anyways, we don't know yet, right? But interesting now that now they're activating all these stem cells that have the ability to fix the kidney, but they need the program. So it's fasting, mimicking diet, giving them the program to go into the kidney and fix them, and the data suggesting that that's going on. Okay, so then finally, biological age, our FMD cycles making people younger, and the answer using these bioage markers, these blood markers developed by Morgan Levine, in 2 different clinical trials, people on average became 2.5 years younger, right? So just by 3 cycles, once a month for 3 months, 2.5 years younger. Okay, so then something that doesn't involve the FMD, and I think is very useful, it's called time-restricted eating, right? So I'll give you the 3 things that I think can change most people's lives, right? The second one is time-restricted eating. So what is time-restricted eating? Right? So if you think about, B and C, right? So is restricting all the consumption of food to a certain number of hours, right? So the most popular one is 16-8. So you eat for 8 hours and you fast for 16 hours, right? And so, and Sachin Panda have done this study, many studies now, and it started with people in California that were eating for an average, people are now eating for an average of 15 hours a day, right? So 1-5. And then he basically said, when he made them go from 15 hours to 11 hours, eating for 11 hours a day instead of 15, now they saw about 3 kilograms of body weight loss, and then energy improving, hunger at bedtime decreasing, sleep improving. So just by making people eat for only 11 hours a day. Now, keep in mind that for those that are doing longer and skipping breakfast, or doing longer, 16-hour, 18-hour, this is not a good idea. There's studies that are very old, starting in the 80s, showing that's not good for you. Don't skip breakfast. So now we came to the conclusion that 12-hour eating and 12 hours fasting is ideal. So 8 a.m., 8 p.m., and at 8 p.m. stop eating, or so. It could be 9 a.m., 9 p.m., and then that's it. That's all you get until the morning after. Very simple, and that already can have a big effect, and the great majority of people are not doing this. And this does not involve any calorie restriction, so it does not tell you how much you should eat. It just says stop eating after 12 hours from the start. Okay, and the third one is, okay, what is the everyday diet that makes probably people live longer? And so we call it the longevity diet. And the longevity diet really learns from everything, learns from people like Okinawa and Japan, and certain villages in Italy, and Loma Linda, California, and the mice and the rats and the monkeys, right? You just put it all together to say, what should people eat that makes them a lot healthier and a lot longer lived, right? So if you just think about proteins, remember from the beginning I say proteins are a key in accelerating, increasing the growth factor, that increase the aging process. 10 years ago, we had done a study using the US CDC database. So what about Americans that ate a lot of proteins versus Americans that ate very little proteins, right? And it turned out that those that have a high protein diet had a 4-fold increase in cancer risk, and about a 75% increase in cancer mortality risk, and about a 75% increase in overall mortality risk, right? But only if there were a baseline 65 or younger, right? So if there were 65 and older, now those on a fairly high protein diet we're doing better, right? So now, if you're older, you might need a little bit, you don't need a high protein diet, but you need a sufficient protein diet. You cannot be malnourished. Whereas the younger people could deal with very low levels, like less than 10% of calories coming from proteins. Okay. So then, not surprisingly, right, the Okinawans, which had one of the longest life expectancy in history, historically they had very low protein diet, so only 39 grams of protein per day, all of them vegetable, all of them plant-based, right? So is it a coincidence that they also had the longest lifespan? Is it a coincidence that if you want to make mice or rats live longer, you protein restrict them, right? If you protein restrict them or methionine restrict a mouse and a rat, they live longer or a lot longer and much healthier, right? So the point is that we're seeing this from all kinds of directions, from Okinawa, from the epidemiological studies, and also from the basic research study. And another group of people where we see little villages in Italy, they have a long life. And again, you're seeing people historically on lots of legumes and lots of low protein diet. They're also amino acid deficient, meaning like the legumes have very low levels of essential amino acids. So not only they already had a low protein diet, but like the Okinawans had very low levels of the amino acids that accelerate the aging process. Okay, and then one slide, and I'm almost done. There's a lot of I call them entertainers, right? That now the world, we're now starting to see cancer in 20-year-olds, colorectal cancer in very young males. And we see breast cancer in very young females. What's happening, right? We never got, 32-year-old with breast cancer or a 28-year-old with colorectal cancer. Is it possibly that this protein craze, right? Protein is everywhere. And in the United States, but not just in the United States, I see it here in Europe, if you turn on anything, when they did a survey of Americans, what is the healthiest food that you can eat? The number one, they answered, was proteins, right? So the worst possible food of all is now considered to be the healthiest food of all, right? And one of the reasons is people think it's going to make them gain a lot of muscle, right? So if you eat proteins, they're going to add a lot of muscle. And these are big studies, right? And if you're looking at the muscle strength or muscle mass, FFM is muscle mass, right? How much muscle you have. So the big increase in muscle comes from resistance training, working out, right? It doesn't come from the extra protein. So if you add extra protein, so if you go from 1.3 to 1.8, you get almost nothing, very little advantage. You get a big effect of training, almost no effect of proteins. And if you look at people that are not training, it makes no difference at all. That's the panel on the right, where it says FFM, 0.83 grams per kilogram is what we recommend for aging. And now you go more than twice as much, no difference, right? So in the absence of training, it makes no difference whatsoever whether you have all these proteins. But it's going to make a difference in your aging acceleration, in your disease profile, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we need to go back to that 0.83, which almost nobody has anymore, but it can have such an important role. So the longevity diet is mostly plant-based. I just told you about the proteins until age 65, 70, and then maybe just a slight increase, 1 gram per kilogram after. It has to be good quality. It cannot be all, let's say, legumes, because if you only have legumes, then you're going to have too low levels of essential amino acids. But now if you have legumes, whole grains, and nuts, those are all good sources of proteins. And so, yeah, no red or processed meat, low eggs, low sugar, low refined grains. Now, of course, even centenarians occasionally had red meat, so it's not that bad, but most of the statistics show it at the very top of the unhealthy food, whether it's red meat or especially processed red meat. And then, wine has been demonized, but now it turns out that up to 3 or 4 glasses a week has no negative effect on longevity. Of course, you don't want to combine alcohol with other risk factors. So alcohol is a risk factor for certain cancers. You don't want to, if you already have other risk factor for that cancer, you don't want to add the alcohol to it. Then I already told you about eat within 12 hours a day. And also in the foundation clinics, we are using a lot of this lunch skipping for people that we think are not going to lose weight and they're going to need GLP-1 drugs. So we do, and in this case, they suffer for about 2 months skipping lunch, but then eventually the brain gets used to it, and it's just like skipping breakfast, only it does not have any negative association. And so this is one of the tools we use in the clinic to allow people to lose weight, suffer for 2 months, and then sort of enjoy the ability to have maybe 2 meals and 2 snacks for the rest of the day and keep your weight down. And then the FMD already told you about, maybe 2 to 4 fasting mimicking diet cycles per year, and that can have a tremendous difference. And this is a study from Norway, looking at millions of people in China, the Europe, and the United States, and in fact, matching very well the longevity diet with legumes and whole grains and nuts being the most beneficial as far as life expectancy is concerned, and white red meat and processed meat being the worst, and sugars and refined grains being the worst for making it to a long life. And they're also showing that even at age 60, if you switch to this diet, the life expectancy increases 8 to 9 years. It's really a remarkable, even if somebody had a bad diet until 60, and then you make a change, 8 to 9 years of life expectancy increase. And if you do it at 80, it's still 3 to 4 years, right? Now, this is just changing the everyday diet. This is not counting everything else that you can do. So, the exercise, the sleep, the fasting mimicking diet, et cetera, the 12-hour. So now you see that altogether, you're probably looking at maybe a 20 to 25-year life expectancy difference between those that do all the right things and those that do all the wrong things. And this is, if you look at Chicago, for example, from the zip code, the sort of wealthiest zip code, to the worst zip code, there's a 30 years life expectancy difference, right? Of course, there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just food and lifestyle, but 2 zip codes can have a 30-year difference in life expectancy. And to just show you how powerful what you do is for your longevity. Now, keep in mind that the wealthiest Chicago zip codes are not necessarily adopting all these things, right? So potentially the increase is even larger. And so with that, I'm just going to end. So with chronological age comes an increase in biological age. Your body ages and your disease risk increases. So I think longevity diet, fasting mimicking diet, 12-hour TRE can have big effects. Now, many clinical trials on this, a lot of epidemiological data coming from all kinds of directions. So this is really not very much on my opinion anymore. It's really a lot of data. Of course, my opinion is also in there, but I think that it is supported also by the Harvard, what's called Alternative Healthy Eating Index, is very much almost 100% in agreement with all the things that I've told you about. And so that's all I have. Thank you.